shots rang out. And I turned around towards the gunfire as it was echoing like cannon fire between a set of projects, and a whole bunch of children were running down a hill, and I sprinted through the kids towards the gunfire that seemed to be still ringing in my ears. And I got there as another young man was stumbling backwards off the steps. He fell into my arms, and I looked over his shoulder, and his chest was filling up with this red blood. And I looked down and sort of held him, tried to hold the blood into his chest to stop it. He started coughing and gagging, and foamy red blood just started pouring out of his mouth. I'm screaming at people to please call an ambulance, please call an ambulance. And as I also screamed to tell somebody to tell me who he was, what was his name. And I sat there in probably one of the more uncomfortable moments of my life, just whispering in Wazn's ears. His name was Wazn Miller, whispering in his ear, saying, stay with me, not knowing anything of what to do, just holding my hands in this boy's bloody chest. It seemed like a whirlwind was going on around me. So much was flashing through my mind as I sat there just trying to hold this child. As his breathing stopped, as I reached into his mouth, not knowing what I was reaching for, trying to clear the foamy blood out of his mouth, hoping that he would just start breathing again. And the ambulance finally came, pushed me out of the way, ripped open his shirt, where I now saw 3 gunshot wounds in his front and 1 in his side, and he was dead. And I just stood there as cops asked me questions, and I tried to articulate whatever I had witnessed to them. And I went home that night, and I went into my apartment, and I was done. I went into an apartment with no heat and no hot water, and I saw that my dream that I invested in, this idea that this community could stay together, could withstand politics, could withstand this community that had in so many ways showed me light and hope, that was now being threatened and being choked. I just sat there in the sink and just tried to wipe this kid's blood off of me. And I remember scrubbing his blood and starting to cry into the sink and continuing to scrub. And even after the blood was gone, I just still felt his blood on my hands. And I just got angry, and I'll tell you, I got angry at my country, a country that could have a perverse obsession with the murder of young white girls, Natalie Holloway or Jean-Benet Ramsey, and yet black boys and girls were dying all the time in my city, and nobody even knew their names. And Wazin's name kept ringing in my mind, and I got angry about it, and more angry. And I felt myself indulging in something that I rarely do. I tend to often have a sense of just bold optimism about the world, but I had it. And I was just slamming my hands on the sink and went into my bedroom and lay down around space heaters that seemed to be the only hope for heat in this decaying building. And I sat up through the night, in and out of sleep, and I woke up the next morning and came down in the elevator, which blissfully was working, and often it wasn't. Residents had to walk 16 flights for those who lived on my floor. And I come out into the lobby, and there I see Miss Jones's head. And this woman is now in my life a pain in my ass, but she is also an amazing vision of power for me. And just seeing in the back of her head, I stopped and stared. She didn't see me. I just stopped and stared. And one story from her life, I found myself holding on to like an anchor to keep me rooted in who I was, or it's like a lifeline to pull myself out of where I was at that point. And it was a simple story that she told me that blew me away. And it was a story of her son, who served in the American military overseas, came home from his service, and was in Brick Towers for a brief period of time. And Miss Jones had a neighbor of hers that started pounding on her door. She opened the door. The neighbor couldn't speak, was in tears, grabbed Miss Jones, dragged her down 5 flights of stairs into the lobby, and there was Miss Jones's son on his back, bleeding the floor of the lobby floor red. And Miss Jones says she fell to her knees and started wailing and crying, and her son was murdered in Newark. And she tells me this story, and this is the part that I found myself holding on to and clinging on to. She tells me this story, and I'm looking at this old woman, and this happened, well over a decade ago, and I'm looking at her, and I said, Miss Jones, I said, you and me, she and I were 2 of the only people that were paying market rent to be in these buildings. And I said, I know where you work, Miss Jones. I know the money you make. I said, you don't have to live here. I said, Miss Jones, why do you still stay in Brick Towers? Why are you living here? And she looks at me and she crosses her arms, and by now you know her way. She said, why do I still stay here in Brick Towers? I said, yeah. Why am I living here in these buildings? I said, yes, Miss Jones. She goes, why am I still in Department 5A? I said, yes, Miss Jones. And she stuck out her chest and stood up straight and she said, because I'm in charge of Homeland Security. And I laughed at this woman who is not of many degrees, and not of any high academic attainment, but I just looked at this woman and I realized that in that little simple attitude, she encapsulated to me what are the sustaining ideals of our nation. If you look at the history of humanity, go back to Jerusalem in the year 69-70 when the Second Temple fell, go to the fall of Rome in 476, go to the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, you'll see that no civilization ever fails simply because of external threats. They fail because of internal corruption, because of their failure to make manifest the ideals that they believe in, the failure to be who they say they are. And here was this woman who knew more than anybody else that we are not a nation that has lived up to its ideals. That when children stand up and say one nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all, that it is aspirational at its best. Here was a woman that witnessed untold tragedies, both personally and in her neighborhood. Here was a woman that was still willing to stand. And she stood with me, standing upon many of the broken dreams of the most profound people who died in that complex. And we had too many people die, from Miss Gloria, who died in front of her children being shot to death, to even Hassan Washington, who died right before I left Brick Towers. Here she stood there, unwilling to be moved, no matter if she was going to be taken by this earth by God and still not to see the manifestation of her dreams. She still stood. And to me, ultimately, that is the challenge to us. We've inherited this nation from people like her, who we will never study, who we will never know, who understood what it meant to be about the public interest, who did not wait around to be told, who did not read law books and acquiesce to that which is. They constantly said, I'm going to shape this country around my highest and most profound ideals for myself. I'm going to bring a deeper, richer, more textured, more nuanced idea of this nation, and I'm going to make that real.